Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and thank you for joining us for our special webinar on maritime security and the environment, how women protect and defend Southeast Asia's future prosperity, supported by the United States Indo-Pacific Command. We would like to give the floor to Pacific Forum's president, Dr. David Santoro, for welcome remarks. David, over to you.
Thank you, Ariel. Aloha, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining us today for our Women, Peace and Security webinar on maritime security and the environment, how women protect and defend Southeast Asia's future prosperity. As Ariel mentioned, my name is David Santoro, and I am president of Pacific Forum, a Honolulu-based research institute focused on defense and security policy in the Indo-Pacific. So Pacific Forum is pleased to hold this webinar in partnership with the US Indo-Pacific Command to explore linkages between the health of the maritime environment and security, both for individuals and broader national dynamics. Over the next 90 minutes, we will hear from our expert panel about how gender factors into maritime and resource management issues in one of the currently fastest growing subregions in the world. By considering some of the ways that women participate in the maritime domain and how they safeguard their communities' economic prosperity and stability, we hope to underscore why a gender perspective is essential to seeing the bigger picture and what risks we take in not considering gender in these complex dynamics. Now, just a note on format, the discussion, which will include feedback and Q&A from the audience, will be moderated by Ms. Whitney Yadao Evans, and reactions to speakers' presentations will be provided by Dr. Asura Sael. And with that, I'll now hand over the mic to Dr. Delana Sawyers, who's gender analyst in the Office of Women, Peace and Security. Dr. Sawyers will provide welcome remarks on behalf of the US Indo-Pacific Command. Dr. Sawyers, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David. I echo your enthusiasm for today's topic as we continue our series of discussions on gender and apply that lens to lives and livelihoods within the maritime environment. US Indo-Pacific Command Office of Women, Peace and Security is honored to support this event with our partners, Pacific Forum, and together in collaboration, amplify voices often not heard by asking, what does security mean to you? And what are your interests and needs? This type of deliberate inclusion is an integral part of all of our efforts at Indo-PACOM Women, Peace and Security, reflected in our planning, training, resourcing, and collaborative efforts. Effective collaboration requires recognizing talent. We have done that today with our speakers and our moderator, Ms. Whitney Evans. Whitney is the Gender and Safeguards Manager at Conservation International. Today brings her unique background of maritime conservation, community-based management, and gender mainstreaming in Asia Pacific, Africa, and Latin America. Numerous initiatives in environmental policy and community collaboration round out impressive skills in a spirit of giving back to the community. And now I'll give the floor to our moderator to begin today's webinar. Whitney, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sawyers. So aloha, my name is Whitney Yadao Evans, and on behalf of the Pacific Forum for US Indo-Pacific Command, I am pleased to welcome you to today's special webinar, Maritime Security and the Environment, how women protect and defend Southeast Asia's future prosperity. In recent years, there has been greater consensus among maritime security practitioners about the links between the health of the marine environment and national security. This has been reflected by the elevation of marine resource management priorities, such as the sustaining of fisheries and coastal ecosystems, as well as addressing threats such as illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing, known as IUU fishing, over traditional maritime concerns like trafficking, piracy, and robbery. In many of Southeast Asia's coastal communities, the depletion and degradation of the marine environment exacerbates cycles of social instability on land as well as conflict at sea. ASEAN states comprise more than 173,000 kilometers of coastline and host over a third of the world's coastal and marine habitats. In the Coral Triangle alone, the sustenance and livelihoods of an estimated 400 million people are directly linked to the ocean. However, coastal communities are not homogeneous, and not everyone benefits from maritime activities equally. This becomes especially clear when aquaculture and fisheries value chains are examined through a gender lens. Even though in many places women constitute nearly half of the jobs in these value chains, their contributions are often socially and systematically undervalued and overlooked. In this webinar, we'll explore some of the ways that women participate in marine domain and actively safeguard their communities' economic prosperity and stability. Most importantly, we hope to underscore the risks in not acknowledging gender in the maritime sector, maritime security. To help us examine these issues further, we are joined by prominent experts, Ms. Rili Johani of the Coral Triangle Center in Indonesia, and Dr. Aizani Mujahid, Senior Lecturer from the University of Malaysia Sarawak and the Malaysian focal point for the Coral Triangle Initiative's Women's Leaders Forum. We'll start with a brief introduction to both of our speakers. Ms. Rili Johani is the co-founder and executive director of the Coral Triangle Center, a learning center of excellence on coastal and marine resource management. She has over 25 years experience working to improve the management and financial stability of marine protected areas and reduce the use of unsustainable fishing practices in Southeast Asia. Furthermore, she was part of the core team of founding partners that helped establish the multinational Coral Triangle Initiative for coral reefs, fisheries, and food security. To learn more about her work in the Coral Triangle Center, you can visit the organization's webpage, which will be shared in the session chat now. Joining Ms. Johani is Dr. Aizani Mujahid. Dr. Mujahid is a senior lecturer in maritime and marine science in the field of physical oceanography at the University of Malaysia Sarawak. She is recognized for expertise in coastal and marine ecosystems, climate change adaptation, and fisheries and women in fisheries. She serves as the Vice President of Malaysian Security for Marine Science and represents Malaysia to the Coral Triangle Initiative for Coral Reefs, Fisheries, and Food Security's Women's Leaders Forum. Again, to learn more about her work, you can visit her university and Google Scholar profiles, which will be shared in the session chat now. We are also grateful to be joined by Dr. Ashura Saleh, who will be providing reactions to the speakers' presentations as our webinar discusses. Dr. Saleh is an adjunct fellow at the Pacific Forum and special advisor for maritime security at Yokosuka Council for Asia Pacific Studies. Now, before I turn the floor over to our speakers, we have a couple disclaimers for your attention. The views expressed by speakers and myself as moderator do not necessarily reflect the views and official positions of the U.S. Department of Defense, the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, or the United States government. All views, opinions expressed in this webinar do not necessarily reflect the positions of the Pacific Forum or the speaker's home institutions. Finally, all remarks, including those during the question and answer portion, are on the record and will be shared on the Pacific Forum's YouTube channel following the session. We will also be conducting polling throughout today's program to get our audience's opinions on these critical issues. As a warm-up, we'll run our first polling question now. In which area can women's participation make the biggest impact on maritime security in Southeast Asia? Active duty and law enforcement, policy and governance, research and advocacy, maritime sector professionals, all of the above, or other. We'll give our audience another 15 to 20 seconds to submit their answers. Thank you very much, and we will now be closing the poll. Sharing our results. Thank you. We see overwhelming consensus that all of these things are very important with an emphasis in policy and governance. Thank you very much. And without further ado, let me turn it over to our first speaker, Ms. Johani.
So thank you so much, Whitney, and the organizers for this seminar, the Pacific Forum in particular. I really appreciate it to be a part of this prestigious panel and to present on the Women Leaders Forum in the Coral Triangle Initiative context that we helped establish with several partners. So I look forward to go through the presentation. Can I have the first slide, please? Yeah, great, thank you. I would like to present a little bit some of the activities that are going on for women groups in the Coral Triangle. Here we see a map of the Coral Triangle region. And the region consists of 6 countries: Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, Timor-Leste, Papua New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands. So the dark red area constitutes the Coral Triangle region. And it is widely recognized by the scientific community as one of the epicenters for marine biodiversity, with more than 550 species of corals can be found in each of those countries, and also an incredible reef fish diversity. And it forms a global refuge for coral reefs around the world, with a highly diverse genetic pool for coral species. Next, please. Yeah. Here we see some statistics. So it harvests 76% of all coral species in the world, but also provides food security for more than 130 million people living in and around the Coral Triangle. Unfortunately, the threats are also staggering at an urgent rate of destruction, including destructive fishing practices, impact of climate change, widespread pollution, plastic pollution, and marine debris. So there's an urgent need for protection and action to abate those threats. Thank you. Next, please. Yeah. So CTC is a Coral Triangle Center is a non-profit foundation based in Bali. And we established CTC in 2010 with the mission to build up local capacity for long-term marine conservation in the Coral Triangle region. We dedicated the foundation to this geography, recognizing its importance, global significance for food security, for marine biodiversity and fisheries. And we really wanted to focus on capacity building and the need to engage especially local groups in the conservation and protection of the reefs, particularly local government, local communities, but also especially women, and more we also focus on youth groups to engage in caring for the coastal and marine ecosystems. Next, please. CTC is also an official member of the Coral Triangle Initiative on coral reefs, fisheries, and food security. And we are also a member of the IUCN.
Thank you, everyone, for your patience. It seems that Dr. Reilly has had lost connection. Let's give her a couple of seconds, see if she can come back in. Otherwise, we'll move to the response from our discussant. All right. I think now it's probably best if we move on to the response from our discussant, and hopefully Reilly will be able to join us again later. But we can also come back to our discussant, Dr. Saleh, later on if you prefer. Dr. Saleh, are you prepared to respond to what Reilly has presented thus far?
Definitely. I think that Rini has, it is at the start of her presentation. So we've really just started getting to the gist of it and learning about what the Coral Triangle Center does. But I do admire the fact that we do have, a strong framework of civil societies within Southeast Asia itself, recognizing that there is a vast gender disparity within the maritime environment. And so they've also recognized that the solution to this is capacity building, grassroots capacity building, if we can be a bit more specific with that, especially in trying to engage the women community by the coast. I think that moving forward, we were just about to look into the type of methods or programs that the CTC pursues. Moving forward, I think it would be helpful to think about what kind of barriers exist when trying to implement these programs, and if these programs are actually also supported within a broader framework of, say, legislation, and also if other sectors of the society, be it maritime security professionals and also enforcement agencies, also work hand in hand with these community programs. Most often, for example, we see in the Philippines, they've got this Bantay Dagat program where the enforcement agencies work very closely with the community for them to be their eyes and ears in order to address any maritime crime, including destructive fishing practices, for example. And so quite clearly, if we are able to then hone in into the role of women within such programs, this would be extremely useful. Looking forward to the rest of Dr. Rini's presentation, and thanks very much for this.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saleh, for your remarks. I think for now, what we'll do is move on to our second speaker, Dr. Azani Mujahid. You're ready for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll just share my screen now. Okay, thank you very much for the earlier introduction. So my name is Dr. Azani Mujahid. I'm with UST Malaysia Sarawak, that's on the Borneo side of Malaysia. I'm involved in a lot of the work in the Coral Triangle Initiative through the Women's Leaders Forum, which Ibu really was able to touch a little bit on. A lot of the training that happens in CTC includes as well training for women, specifically for women through the Women's Leaders Forum. I'm also the Vice President for the Malaysian Society of Marine Sciences, and through the MSMS, our association has done a lot of work specifically for women as well as the youth. So there's a lot of engagement online using social media, as well as pre-COVID, we were able to run workshops with the communities. So that would be engagement with local communities directly involved in fisheries. I'm also in a project now under the Gamification Center in the university, which is under the program, a larger umbrella program of creative culture, which is using frugal methodologies and trying to embed a lot of the SDGs of climate change, life underwater, life on land, together with quality education for the children. So a lot of the work is aiming at children. But besides that, on the other cap that I wear, I'm actually a marine scientist, and I do a lot of work with climate change adaptation, as well as marine ecosystems. So I'll just quickly move on. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm part of the Women's Leaders Forum. So I'm a representative from Malaysia to the WLF. And this was a cross-cutting initiative established quite recently in 2014. And the purpose of this was to engage actively with women who are working on marine fisheries issues within the Coral Triangle, and hopefully working with women and girls as part of the solution finding. We'll be able to help the countries to achieve any of the plans of action, the national or regional level. So I'm sharing here some of the perspectives coming from my state in Sarawak. I'll have to put a little caveat in my discussions that a lot of it's quite new. It's based on post-workshop that we've done under the WLF that's been conducted at CTC as well as in UST Malaysia Terengganu. So shout out to all the ladies who have been involved in the initial training and work to help us understand about including gender in our research. So how to have gender segregated data sets, for example, especially in the work that we're doing for our fisheries and aquaculture sectors. So most of it comes from, the tools come from this book that you can see here, this aptly colored pink manual. And some of the data I'll present here is part of a participatory survey that I've done with the institutes and agencies within the state. And this was done in 2019. And then some additional work quite recently, so this is quite fresh and we haven't been able to publish it, from a master student of mine on the role of women in one of the larger marine fishery villages in the state. So when we ask the questions about, are there specific programs or projects which would embed, specifically embed gender or women perspectives, quite often we would find that women perspectives are overlooked. In about half the projects, they would say maybe in the collection of the metadata, but not specifically. And most of the time it's no. Right? And even if they do have some specific gender research that's done, it's not for the coastal communities or fishing communities. So when we go down and we have engagement or interviews with the grassroots, we'll have other opinions, which I will share here. So these are some of the voices, and I've not edited them too much, so you can see the impact of their voices. The first one is they say that the position of men is generally overpowering over the female. Please bear in mind that a lot of this translated from Malay, but I will try to give the right context so it's so that you can understand that. So the position of men is generally overpowering the female. So they're saying that generally in the society, the men have the higher power.
All right, well, thank you very much, Dr. Mujahi. Hopefully we'll see you back online very soon. Dr. Saleh, would you be prepared to offer some remarks?
Thank you. Thanks, Whitney. Yeah, definitely. I think Dr. Mujahid was just really getting into the crux of the gender disparity that we are experiencing here in the region. I myself come from Brunei, so we're right, I'm neighbors with Dr. Mujahid really, and so some of the sentiments that she highlighted are some that I can connect with for sure. I think that the primary issue is actually rooted in the framing of the role of women and the role that they do play within the maritime environment. I think it's important to not only shape the perspective of not just the men, but the women themselves. She seems to be implying that there is a self-imposed gender bias within the environment that the women operate in. And so they have implicitly accepted the superior position of men. So in fact, when we do try to emphasize the role of women and the unique relationship they have to the maritime environment, these are often obstructed by not only the perspectives that the men hold, but also the women themselves. So they themselves have overlooked the value that they can add to the aquaculture chain. I think in moving forward, we might want to ask ourselves, how can we reshape this narrative? How can we lend more autonomy and how can we empower these women to recognize their unique skills and their unique talent in the maritime environment? I was also hoping to ask Dr. Mujahid if, this is at the grassroots level, but if we were to escalate this discussion to the professional level, what or where are the gender gaps that she experienced, especially in her participation in the Women Leaders Forum? I see that we have her back on, so I'm really, really keen to hear what she has left to share with us.
Hi, thank you. The internet suddenly went off, but I guess these are some of the challenges working in a third world country. Okay, so I'll share the screen again. Okay, so I'm not sure where it cut off, but I'll just restart a little bit. So the first voice was that the men are generally in the society considered higher in strata than a woman, higher in status, and that's generally accepted. But that's also familiar for many of those in the Asian context. That the men are leaders in the family, and so their voice is more important. And then the fishing communities tend to be male dominated, and there's lack of a gender balance, but this is quite common and not only for fisheries. And then as well, the women lack information on the benefits in their workplace. Some of them work for other middlemen involved in the value chain, and so they are unaware of their rights, and and or most of the time it tends to be that they do not get paid as much as the men, or they do not know about the rights in terms of working hours, for example. And it's quite a cultural norm that most of the workforce tends to be men in fisheries, and so that increases the inequalities already existing within the social classes. And some of the voices we hear, I think very much lead towards that the gender stereotypes in fisheries still exist, and there's a lot of toxic masculinity. And I think quite often as well, we hear that they don't see any problem, because most of the time they have accepted that those are the roles that they play, and men and women play different roles. And even if the women are involved in fisheries, they tend to categorize them as only helpers in a way. They're only involved in like net sewing or feed making for the fish, and they don't think that there's any bias. And they claim that that's because women in terms of energy are not as strong to do some of the work that the men do. And on a preference, they think that women tend to prefer other jobs instead of fisheries. All right, so this is quite interesting, because when we didn't do the survey on the grounds with women who are involved in fisheries itself, in the primary source of income, a lot of the times, so you can see the graph in blue for men and the graph in orange are for women. And these units are basically household units. So we've been able to interview the men and women who are the head of their families. And you can find that, yes, men are involved more heavily in fisheries, but more than half of the women are actively involved in the fishing itself. So this tends to be inland fisheries. So it's around the estuary area or just nearer to the coast, so not out to sea. And then they're also involved in the fish processing. So this matches with other statistics from the region, which is about 80% of women are actually involved in the fish processing, and they are not included in studies of the value chain. And so this is not captured. A lot of this information is not captured. And also then they're involved in other fish trading or selling as well. And if you're talking about secondary source of income, that means not just only the main job. If they have alternative livelihoods, a lot of them also have fisheries as alternative livelihoods. So if they were not involved in the plantation, for example, they are also involved in fisheries. And a lot of the time, the women have fishing as their secondary source of income. And this is not usually captured in a lot of the fish landing data. And women tend to have lesser access to their rights, and that includes the knowledge about the market prices of their fish. You can see that the men tend to sell directly to middlemen, but the women would depend on the market value based on other fishers. They don't only trust the middlemen, but they discuss among themselves to know the prices of, from other fishers, as well as retailers themselves. So they tend to sell directly to retailers. This also is probably because this was quite shocking for us, because we had assumed that a lot of the women were educated, but a lot of the research shows that for the villages, the women do not receive formal education. So it's patchy. They did go to school, but most of the time it was not a full, they did not attend in full. And so they did not have formal education, although the issue here is not about access. They are schools in the village, but there are other reasons which I won't delve into now. But there's lack of formal education, or they only study until the primary education level, and very few continue to secondary or tertiary education. So the women fishers tend to be less educated than the male fishers. So so this leads to some of the other questions that we had about So why do they think this disparity exists? And very strongly, most of them agree that it's due to the lack of education, lack of access to learning the skills or the technologies to help them have other jobs besides fisheries. And some of the times it's because they lack support within the family unit, like partnership assistance or maintenance for the household. And so they have to depend still on secondary jobs, taking fishing as a secondary income. And a lot of them talk about the lack of power or representation. So there are some fishing associations, for example, and this one example that I have is about 80% of that association are women, but the leader will still be a man. They would not choose a woman leader, although majority of their members are women. And so they still have this power distance within the communities that I think needs to be addressed. And besides that, they feel that there's also a lack of laws that specifically include women into the workforce. So I think this is touched quite often about gender not being included in the decision-making and in the laws. I think other points to point out that although it did not come out too often, the lack of jobs or reliable, stable jobs is also an issue. And I think this leads into the discussion that if there are lack of jobs and lack of stable jobs, that people may end up going into illicit activities, including wildlife trading of wildlife from the marine life in the area. And I think that that's something that may be continue to discuss later. And looking forward, I'll just want to touch on the three main points that I think working on the ground and in discussions with other women working in fisheries, the main 3 points is the access and support to education. We need to be more inclusive and include women more in the knowledge and skill building so that they can understand about sustainable development, especially for the marine and fishery sectors. And then secondly, there's still not strong partnerships and collaborations, but if we try to grow that on the grassroots levels especially, we can try to create more solutions with the communities themselves that can bring more meaningful progress and long-term progress for some of the socioeconomic issues and environmental issues that are faced by the coastal communities. And lastly, I would like to touch that a lot of the times the projects that are very successful and have continuity that we have seen in Terengganu, in Sabah, in Malacca, as well as in Sarawak itself, in the maritime states, is that when the women and the community are the heart of it. That means they are in the middle and included into all the planning. A lot of the times the interventions do work because then they take into account a lot of the cultural differences and the cultural needs and customs. And that makes it easier to transition into the change that needs to happen. Okay, that's a little picture of me when I was young. And I think one of the targets of the group research that we've been working on is that we have to concentrate on the youth, because that's the easiest entry point to help them to change. And I think children are really the key to, and the youth are really the key to starting a lot of the change that we need to see in the future. We do a lot of work with Life Below Water in University Malaysia Sarawak. I think in the QS rankings, we rank one of the highest in Southeast Asia. And I think this is quite similar to a lot of the Malaysian universities that in terms of SDG for Life Below Water, we rank very strong, as well as for the SDG for women and climate action. All right. So just a very quick, I believe my 10 minutes is up. Thank you very much to the Pacific Forum for inviting me. And I'll just thank all my partners that we do a lot of our research with in UST Malaysia Sarawak, the Creative Culture team, my research team in ECWAS, with the Women Leaders Forum, the Coral Triangle Initiative, as well as the Malaysian Society for Marine Sciences. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mujahid. To all of our audience members, please make note of any questions you have for Dr. Mujahid, and we'll get to that in the Q&A section of the webinar. And Dr. Saleh, I recognizing that you've already given us some wonderful remarks, but turning the floor over to you. Do you have any other brief remarks to the rest of Dr. Mujahid's presentation?
Thank you, Whitney. Dr. Mujahid, I thought that was so brilliant and such a personal insight into the coastal life in Sarawak. And I think it is also a microcosm of the rest of the region, really. I thought I could very briefly just highlight some of the key points that you've mentioned, and maybe this will help quite naturally bunch into some angles that we can look into in our discussion. I think that my main takeaway is that maritime insecurity is rooted in gender disparity to a large extent. In fact, I think this is an extremely understudied angle, and this is something that deserves more attention. In the dissertation research that was done, I'm glad that this angle was actually looked into, and we saw that quite clearly. Women are not granted equal rights due to their disparity in getting the same level of access to infrastructure and public services that their male counterparts have. You mentioned how they have less access to formal education, for example, and also in better learning about sustainable development. Some other areas you mentioned was that they also have lack of, the legislation does not support their equal role in the maritime environment. And they've also got a lack of not enough access to economic resources. But some gaps that got me thinking is, while we try designate their lack of access to infrastructure as the main causal factor that has led to their unequal role in the maritime environment, is it fair for us to actually say, for example, have the women's lack to formal education actually impacted their access to price information, to information on the pricing, and also their ability to sell fish to the middlemen? Should we put the blame on, oh yeah, women don't have enough formal education, they're not smart enough to be able to understand that, oh, they don't have enough information, all their information and prices only come from other fishers and from other retailers. What is actually stopping them from actually reaching out to the middlemen? I don't think it's, education access. I'm sure it's quite more to that. And you have alluded to that. You mentioned, certain nuances within their own society, within their own culture that may have been imposed by their male-dominated environment that they live in that have prohibited them from doing so. And so if we were to give women more access to education, would this in any way be able to resolve the fact that they are still limited? They are still getting limited access to information because of the structure of the environment that they operate in. I think that in moving forward, the research that has been done sets a very strong precedence in us recognizing the fact that, yes, there is strong gender disparity within maritime security, within Sarawak, within Borneo, and also Southeast Asia. I think our next step is to actually ask ourselves, what can we do? And how can we better target our programs to address this gender disparity? Although obviously working on legislation and education would actually be extremely helpful, I think what would be most important is to actually create a paradigm shift within the environment that they operate in. You mentioned that the value of women, for example, is that they play a larger role in fish processing. Why is this so? And are there certain skills within women that make them better in fish processing as opposed to men? You also mentioned that women, for example, make up a third of the fishing workforce. Why a third? That's actually a large, that's quite a prominent segment. But then most importantly, I think you alluded to the value of women and the long-term role that they play in ensuring the sustainability of programs. You called them the heart of the community. You alluded to the fact that they are able to that they are able to actually recognize differences in culture, differences in the way they operate, and therefore take all these into consideration and then implement them into actionable programs. How then can we take this paradigm shift and be able to operationalize it? You also said that we should place a lot of emphasis on the youth, which I think is extremely important. But then again, you know, the youth, as with the women, operate within this environment. How do we get the parents, the guardians of the youth, to actually have a paradigm shift themselves in order to support the younger generation in taking a more equal role as they participate in the maritime environment? I think the problems in gender disparity in the maritime environment are extremely rooted in the fact that in culture, in society, in norms. And so we will need to try achieve this paradigm shift in order for us to address more actionable or pragmatic solutions on the ground, including education access, legislation, and such. I look forward to discussion. I think this would be a very interesting talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saleh, for some very insightful remarks. And I'm thrilled now to say that really Jahani has been able to rejoin our webinar. And so now we will actually get to hear the rest of her presentation. So I'll turn it over to you now, really.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Whitney. And sorry, apologies everyone for the problems here with my signal, but I'm happy to present my presentation now. Thank you, Ariel. Yes. So I left it at the Coral Triangle map and the biodiversity threats to the Coral Triangle. And I think a lot of important points were made by Azani and also by Ashura. So I look forward to also weave those into my presentation here. Just want to highlight that the Coral Triangle Center is involved directly in supporting marine protected areas in Indonesia and Timor-Leste. We have long-term programs going on in Nusa Penida, offshore Bali, as well as in the Banda Islands and Atauro Island in Timor-Leste. And we support a range of other MPAs as well in Indonesia and the region, covering a total of 387,000 hectares. And by doing that on the ground, we also have very much direct insights on the role of women and how they can be involved or should be involved in protecting the coastal and marine resources. Next, please. So in 2009, the 6 heads of states from the Coral Triangle countries got together in Manado, and they signed off on a collaboration that was really focused on coral reefs, securing fisheries and food security for the region. It was a one-of-a-kind agreement that was really focused on the protection and effective management of coral reef areas and associated systems in the region, supported also by the US government, Australian government, Asian Development Bank, the Global Environmental Facilities, and also the 3 NGOs, Conservation International, Nature Conservancy, WWF, and later on other groups were officially recognized as a strategic partner, including the Coral Triangle Center. Next, please. So one of the things that CTC was focused on was engaging more specific constituencies to support the Coral Triangle Initiative. It was considered a little bit top-down and needed much more engagement from different groups, particularly on the ground. And so with support from USAID and US DOI, we were able to engage or establish a Women Leaders Forum as well as a government network. This local government network was meant to really engage the mayors and governors in the 6 Coral Triangle countries, as they are very much at the forefront of making decisions on investments and related matters in the coastal zone. And the other forum was the Women Leaders Forum, which I like to focus on. And we have now about 200 members, women around the region who are engaged in this forum. And we established it recognizing that we needed to give a voice to the women leaders in the region who are often pivotal in their community and really spearheading specific conservation and effective management activities on the ground. Next, please. So we set up a peer learning network for women. And I think what I'd like to emphasize is that we kept it very informal forum. So we sort of helped with the support from the CT6 countries, non-government organizations, universities to help identify key women in the region who were involved in very effective management on the ground for coastal and marine resources. And it led to the identification of 6 grassroots level leaders on the left side. And they were recognized and awarded at the forum and very much highlighted their role in their village and how they actually were able to galvanize a village behind them to, for example, look at pollution issues or fisheries issues or coastal protection. And by recognizing them, we were also able to empower them in the village and provide them a small grant to further support their activities on the ground. And the fact that they were recognized regionally also boosted their prestige in the village, and they were able to take part much more into village decision-making processes and so forth. So also helping to just recognize the women role in their village and more internationally boosted their ability to further implement projects on the ground. And we started to identify more women leaders in each of the countries, particularly in government and non-government organizations, and try to establish a women leaders forum that would connect the women and also enable them to develop a sort of regional program for women leaders forum and help each other share lessons learned in coastal zone management and marine protected areas, sustainable fisheries programs. Next, please. And so I think it was also very important to mention that the Women Leaders Forum was early on very well supported also by the Coral Triangle Secretariat and the leadership as well. And a lot of male support actually early on was very critical to highlight and sort of operationalize this Women Leaders Forum within the Coral Triangle Initiative context. And with that support, we were able to expand the Women Leaders Forum, and also when they returned to their respective organizations, there was also much more support for their vision, for their programs, and for the implementation. We supported the development of a leadership training module. So we invited 6 teams from each country to develop a leadership model so they can in turn engage other women in their countries by implementing this training. And by doing this in a participatory approach, we could really focus on the key topics that they felt were important, including here organizational management, communication, negotiation and influence, conflict management, partnership and networking. And so the training module is available for everyone who's interested in that. And this module is now used in each of the 6 countries by the women who were involved. So those who were involved came from government agencies, also from universities, as well as non-government organizations. So really a mix of people who were helping to establish this training module. And it's, I think, very important also to see this further institutionalized. Some of our countries have ministries for women empowerment, and this has also further been distributed with those particular ministries, for example, to further mainstream this type of leadership training to empower women to effectively engage in coastal zone management. Next, please. So we also selected 6 teams. It was an intergenerational learning experience for mentors and mentees. So we looked at a senior government official who would actually help train and mentor a younger colleague or a colleague from another organization, for example, an NGO. And they were tasked to implement their leadership training with a conservation challenge on the ground. And they were given a small grant to implement this. Next, please. And so those small grants were actually very effective. We called it the Conservation Challenge projects, and they received between $3,000 to $5,000 for this project. And they implemented this in 1 year, applying also their leadership skills. And here we listed the different projects that each teams from the 66 countries implemented. For example, in Indonesia, the team focused on reducing mining of corals in the Banda Sea. And they were able to actually leverage their activity with more grants from other sponsors and helped really raise the awareness on the mining of corals and suggested different alternative building materials that actually led to the reduction of mining of corals in that particular area. And in Malaysia, the team focused on green turtle nesting sites. And in the Philippines, they focused more on an advocacy campaign to conserve the oceans and the seas in the Philippines. Next, please. Next slide, yeah. And these were some of the projects in Papua New Guinea, as well as in Timor-Leste, as well as the Philippines. I just want to highlight quickly the project that we implemented in the Arafura and Timor Seas. It's called the CNET program, where we actually engaged women in training the bycatch of fish that would otherwise be discarded by the fishermen, for example, flying fish. And we supported them with handling those fish and turn that into local products for the domestic markets, for example, snacks for that they could sell in supermarkets and so on. But the training that we provided was really about how they could handle the fish, business skills, but also marketing and access to markets, which I think is an important point also to make. And in the course of this project, the income of the women increased with 80%. And they were so happy. Their whole status in the village changed. They were able to support their kids to go to college, and also are now much more taking part in decision-making processes in the village. And so by economic empowerment, giving them much more confidence and training and skills, they were able to really change their situation economically, but also the personal note. They keep on going. This is a self-sustainable project now without any external funding. And I think this is a great example how we could operationalize, the issue of women empowerment and getting them more involved in sustainable fisheries and protection. Next, please. We do the same for the blue swimming crab fisheries, where we work together with Environmental Defense Fund and the Photo Voice International to train women, especially in leadership and technical skills. And we focus on the women pickers in the Tulang Bawang Regency in Sumatra. And it's really, at the moment, we're actually implementing this training, but we expect that at the end of this training, the women can speak and voice out their ideas, capturing changes in resources in the villages. With all these activities in the CTI context, we were able to mobilize the Women Leaders Forum with, again, support from a lot of parties, but spearheaded by the Secretariat, to develop a policy for mainstreaming gender equality and social inclusion in this initiative. And it's based on the rationale that although complex, and when they are understood and operationalized within a specific cultural and historical socioeconomic context, gender equality and social inclusion can help achieve the CTI mission. And it was also widely recognized that the disparity does exist. And the Secretariat commissioned a study on this, which was also focused on alignment with international and regional commitments. Here are some mentioned in this context with the Sustainable Development Goals, but also several commitments and agreements in the Pacific, for example. Next, please. So the purpose is to address the current gender inequalities, but also to provide direction for member states, development partners, and regional secretariat in promoting and mainstreaming gender equality and social inclusion in all activities. So it's meant to be inclusive to all women and men, girls and boys, regardless of age, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability status, religion, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, geographic area, or migratory status. Next, please. So this is my last slide. So this is at the moment being finalized and for adoption by the senior officials meeting by the Coral Triangle countries later this year. And so we try to mainstream the gender equality, social inclusion into the core objectives of the Coral Triangle Regional Plan of Action #2. And it's really focused on the health of coastal and marine ecosystems, as well as risk resilience and socioeconomic conditions and governance. And the whole policy, the GESI policy, would really be integral in all these efforts to really be able to achieve our mission, which is really to effectively manage the coastal and marine ecosystems for food security and fisheries. And the inclusion part, equity part is critical to achieve that mission. And I hope with this presentation, we showed some of the examples how we go about it in terms of setting up a women leaders forum, quite informal, but very effective, engaging different women who in turn can become really agents of change in their countries and in their organizations, but also very specific examples on the ground, how you can improve and empower women in their economic situation, especially in fisheries, as well as in marine protected areas. So thank you so much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Majahani. And such incredible progress at the regional level. Thank you so much for sharing. And over now to our discussant, Dr. Saleh, just some brief remarks, if you may, to help us wrap up our speaker section.
Thanks very much, Whitney. Thank you, Dr. Rini, for that presentation. I think your thoughts really nicely complemented Dr. Mujahid's previous delivery, considering that a lot of the emphasis that Dr. Mujahid placed was on the problems of gender disparity within the maritime environment. So what you did was then offered a solution to that. I think the variety of projects that your organization have pursued, from reducing mining to protecting turtles, so advocacy, and even to pursue seafood sustainability programs, are extremely, extremely helpful, because they have, as you have mentioned, provided a mechanism for women to try grapple with the specific cultural, historical, and socio-economic context, and to eventually achieve equality on par with their male counterparts. They have essentially, entered this explicitly male-dominated structure of society, and have forced these men and both women to really recognize the value that these women leaders play within their community. And so this has boosted their status and also their credibility within the community. This was highlighted by Dr. Mujahid, in which she had mentioned that there was this implicit bias or acceptance of the superior position of men, because women, for example, are not as strong enough as men, and so there is a lot of toxic masculinity. But these programs help to put women on par with them and to recognize the value that women play. And in doing so, by achieving such a certain level of equality, I would say, this has granted women more decision-making power in terms of public participation, which has led to the better implementation of these projects, and also, most importantly, therefore granted women more independent economic power, thereby empowering them as well. And so by being more vocal, I think this has actually helped to help to address this gender disparity, as women are more confident in asserting their values, their thoughts as well. You also mentioned that it's essentially important to encourage inclusive governance. All the emphasis is on bringing women and upholding them and bringing them on par with men. But at the same time, men have to also be part of this conversation. You situated gender disparity within the context of other ocean inequalities, such as socioeconomic, geographic, and even migratory status, which can all create an imbalance that will prevent us from better managing our maritime environment. I think in moving forward, it's important for us to realize that this gender bias is not only propagated by our male counterparts, but also by some of our own female counterparts themselves, where they themselves hold on to this ideology that men are perhaps a bit more superior than them in terms of skill sets and such. And so I definitely agree that, I would like to once again reassert that maritime insecurity is rooted in gender inequality to an extent. And so the solution to this is definitely social inclusion, which can bring more peace in our maritime environment and also protect our food security. Some questions moving forward are maybe, in trying to generate a solution to this and encouraging inclusivity, we want to ask, to what extent are men actually really part of these inclusive programs? To what extent are they supportive of these programs? And to what extent are they willing to embrace this paradigm shift? Also, you mentioned that there is an attempt to try cascade these policies, gender equality within these policies in protecting our maritime environment. Are they also reflected in the legislation? We know that the male-dominated environment does not exist within the grassroots community, but also cascades all the way up to senior level government as well. Is that potentially a barrier in trying to encourage more gender inclusivity in the policies that we use to protect our maritime environment? That's it from me, and I'm looking forward to the discussion very much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saleh. And I also wanted to let our attendees know that we have put some resources in the chat for you that referencing from Rili Jahani's presentation. So please take note of those. All right, and now we are happy to now turn to our audience for your questions and your comments. So please see the instructions for the Q&A session on your screen. So in order to ask a question and or to make a comment, please use the raise hand function located on the tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Wait to be called on and then unmuted by the Pacific Forum staff before speaking. Please state your name, position, affiliation before commenting or asking questions. Alternatively, you can submit your question through the Q&A tab at the bottom. If you submit a comment or question, please remember to include your name and affiliation in your submission. Now, while we wait for some of the questions to queue and for us to think of the wonderful questions we'll discuss, let's run our second polling question. Do you see an increase in women's participation in maritime security as having a positive or negative impact, or is gender irrelevant in this sphere? Thank you very much. As we can see, overwhelming positive with some neutral as well. Thank you very much for your participation. And now to jumpstart the conversation, I'm going to be asking the first question. So to both of our panelists, both of our speakers, Ms. Jahani, as well as Dr. Mujahid, as well as our discussant, Dr. Saleh, I'd love your thoughts on this as well. Assuming the political will and support for actively taking a gendered approach to maritime security was established at all of the necessary international, regional, and national levels, so assuming we're all happy in those spheres, how would we actually go about increasing women's participation in maritime security from a practical standpoint? What would we do first? What would we do second? And perhaps what enabling conditions might we look to improve? That's the first question. I'd be happy to pass it over to Dr. Mujahid for the first response, if you're ready. Or Dr. Saleh, if you are ready, then please jump in.
Hi, is the question, if I got it right, what are the initial steps that we can take, bearing in mind if the policies were in place and it's a perfect world and everything's fine?
Well, if the political will. Yeah, if the political will is established, if all of our lovely legislators and governmental leaders were all on board and supportive, what would our first practical steps be?
Is Ashura going first?
No, by all means, take it away. I wasn't sure if you could hear me. By all means, take it away.
Okay, so I can give my opinion based on the work that we have on the ground that's more focused on marine environment as well as human security in terms of the vulnerabilities of the communities on the ground. So in terms of climate change adaptation, especially, there's a lack of a forum that would discuss with the communities about their needs moving forward. And so then they are in the beginning already included in the next steps. So in the local early action planning, I would say that they're included from the beginning. So to have a forum where they are included in all the discussions. And I've seen that programs that have started with having a forum and followed by their workshops. For example, in Terengganu and in Sabah, the women were brought into it together with the men in the community. And when their voices were included into the decision-making on the next steps, there is a lot easier for a buy-in. And I think for a long-term project to be sustainable beyond when the funding runs out. So that's the problem always with academia. The funding runs out in 2 years and then the project dies. But for the community to then take over after that and for them to build the confidence, the financial literacy, the awareness, it starts really from the beginning. So having that forum and chatting with them. So for me, that would be one.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Mujahid. Dr. Saleh or Ms. Johani, if you have an answer, please speak up now. Otherwise, I'll move on to one of our next questions.
If I may, I think that in an ideal world, if I was president, I would definitely immediately have women in leadership and policy-making positions. I think at the start of the seminar, we had that first poll question, and it was, where would women make the most impact? And indeed, if I could have 50% of the enforcement force be made out of women and for them to be able to operate on vessels just as much as they hold desk jobs, that would be really, really helpful. And for them to play a larger role in policymaking and governance and to hold at least half of the board members when it comes down to actually developing policies. I think when it comes to professionals, obviously we've got great professionals such as, Dr. Johani and Dr. Mujahid on the ground, but we definitely need more of them as well. I think advocacy plays an important role, especially as we talk about inclusive governance. And so it's important for us to ensure that, men continue to be part of this conversation. I think a media campaign would be essentially helpful to put more funding towards that. We could have movies and series all based on, recognizing the role of women in fishing communities. But particularly important is to also ensure that there is access for the fishing communities to be able to reach out to these media platforms. That way we're also able to achieve two different parallel streams at the same time. One would be a paradigm shift through continuous discussion of shifts and norms, and the other one would obviously be more gender representation in terms of the policy-making process.
Thank you so much, Dr. Saleh. Very, very, very interesting answer. Really, Johani, if you would have a burning answer to this question, please let us know. Otherwise, in the interest of time, we'll move on to one of our questions from our attendees.
Okay, maybe just a very quick input. Sorry, I can't put on my video. I have to turn on my computer again, so I won't do that. But I think it's a great question. And I would also argue that you would need special programs. And I think one of our good examples were the small grants. So if there could be a small grant set up in different ministries that would actually help empower the women to implement things on the ground. I think that would be a great example for the village, but also for the government officials themselves. And those, for example, those small grants from the CT6 countries teams inspired also, more action within their own ministry and convinced more male colleagues and their superiors that this is actually a good thing to do. So I think the more tangible things you can organize within your ministry or organization and tie in a budget to that, that would be a great step forward. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ruby. So on to our first question. So actually two attendees have highlighted a similar area. So from Richard Mackey, from who I can't see your affiliation, but thank you for your question, as well as Chuping Hu. So both of you have identified the leadership roles of men in Southeast Asia as a particular potential opportunity. So so to our panelists and to our speakers, wonder what is the role of men in enabling and empowering women to expand their participation? And I'll Dr. Mujahid, if you're ready to go first, we'll just maintain the same order if that works out for you.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. In the work that we're doing here, a lot of the times there's two groups of it. It's either some of the men do not acknowledge that there is a gender disparity, and on the other end, there are men who are, and I would say maybe they are probably a larger proportion of the society that are willing to support the women in their society as well. It's just that, as Ashura also has mentioned, some women have accepted their roles, and so they don't want to step up to accept leadership roles. And that's even quite common in university, that when given options of leadership roles, women sometimes prefer to stand back. But that might also be because of they feel they would have a lack of support, and they assume that their opinions might not be as powerful as a man, so they would still prefer to put a man there as their voice, although they are able to voice their opinions to him. So that was the example of the association that was largely female, but they still chose a male leader. So actually, I think there are a lot of men who are aware of this, like risking the sake of being called a feminist. I think it's not really about a feminist issue or a women issue. It's about equality within the society. Women are more than, are 60% involved or more in the industry. So it's actually about workers' rights. It's about human rights. And I think like you say, it's not just about a women issue, really. It's about the issue that the society is, there's inequality in the society. I think saying that, a lot of the work that CTC has done, for example, and in some of the universities, I can see that when they start working together with civil societies or non-governmental organizations, which are most often equal in men and women, then the society starts to see that other men play a role in this gap, and then they are more willing as well to voice out changes that need to happen to reach this, to plug this gap that we see.
Yes, very important, very large gap to plug. And Dr. Saleh, do you have a response as well?
Yeah, I'd like to compliment Dr. Mujahid's view, really. She speaks about the implicit view that women have of themselves. I think that what's important as well is the parent-child relationship, as we try to empower the girl youths to want to recognize their equal role as well in the maritime environment. Often we see that in Brunei, for example, we see that a lot of the girls are only able to engage in society when their father has allowed them to do so. And this is very different from when it comes to sons, where they're actually encouraged to go out and pursue new experiences, for example. And so this is where I think inclusive governance plays a strong role and should definitely be a key feature of a lot of our programs, where I recognize that a lot of other men that may be quite resistant to this idea of having women on par with them would actually look up to other men who are also, leading these programs, calling for inclusivity, calling for empowering more women. And so maybe, Dr. Mujahid, this may be also one reason why, despite having a majority women organization, the leader is a guy, because nowhere are they going to get representation if they don't also partake in this male-dominated structure. Slowly but surely, I guess, but this is definitely a strong battle, a hard battle for us to win.
Absolutely. Ms. Johani, do you also have a response for us?
Thanks, Whitney. I would just say that, it's very important to get the support from the male environment, so to speak. When we established the Women Leaders Forum, the first reaction was, oh, we also need a male leaders forum. So sort of like, okay, why only women? Why not males? So I think it's very important that to include actually the enabling environment for women. So it also came up during our trainings that even if they are trained or more confident or more empowered, you still need, your superior, your peers in your office or in your organization to also support it. Hence, we also looking into how you can, address the enabling conditions for women empowerment and develop, for example, training programs that would include, for example, male colleagues or male superiors in this sort of effort to mainstream gender equity and equality. So I think it's very important to take that into account, the institutional arrangements, and engage more males in that effort to make it more sustainable, this effort, rather than just investing in a few leaders, because you still need, much more institutional support than just the leaders. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Johani. And so I think touching on your point about social sustainability, I think we can move to our final question for the last 5 minutes of our Q&A session. This last question is from Ms. Catherine Maxwell, WPS Fellow at US Indo-PACOM's Office of Women, Peace and Security. The question is very timely. How has COVID-19 exacerbated the vulnerabilities that women face in fisheries and in maritime conservation? And then thinking, as you mentioned, Ms. Johani, about social sustainability, moving forward from this global pandemic scene, how do we ensure that women aren't left behind again? Please, Dr. Mujahid, we'll turn to you for your first response.
Hi, thank you, Catherine, for your question about the vulnerabilities that the females or women would face during COVID now and post-COVID. As an educator and ourselves in the gamification center running a lot of projects with the communities, we've failed to have access due to all the travel restrictions, that we can't actually go down to the community to continue the long-term efforts that we have engaging with empowerment work that we're doing there. And one of the largest projects we wanted to do was a financial literacy project, as well as and helping the ladies in fisheries there to understand the value chain and where they lie in the processes. I think that is one of the large issues. And when I speak to the friends who are in other civil societies, they also mention the same issue, where they are lacking the access now. They can't go down to the communities to work with them. And so they're starting to see falling out or issues with conservation efforts that have been set up before. And I think that actually opens up to a lot more other issues that come with IUU, the illegal, unreported, unregulated fisheries, because they're saying that they're seeing more infringements from the larger vessels in the open seas. And I think that might be maybe a more sensitive issue, and it's not my specialization to talk more about that, and that's for another time. But I think that then leads to there's how do you say, a sense of insecurity, and so the communities now are not willing to participate in other programs because they're afraid of the situation that they're in now. I'm not sure if Ibu really has any issue in Bali, CTC having access to the communities at the moment, but for us, that's one of the largest issues.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Mujahid. Dr. Saleh, do you have a response as well?
Thanks very much. I'll keep my response short. So I think that COVID-19 has the tendency to exacerbate existing insecurities in our environment, including gender disparity. In fact, in the Philippines, for example, I came across a case study where due to COVID-19, unemployment rose. And so a lot of men that once worked in Manila, for example, were now forced to return back to their villages. And many of them have taken up these fishing roles that have ultimately displaced the roles that the women once held to hold the fort down while their main breadwinner was back in the city, getting most of the income for them. This has obviously led to other maritime crimes such as illegal fishing, as more and more people resort to the fishing industry to just basically get a basic sense of livelihood and to just ride the wave and while they wait to go back to work in the cities. In terms of how we can move forward with this, I think our only solution is to rely on community leaders to really continue with these conservation programs. But obviously this would be extremely difficult to monitor and evaluate. And I fear that perhaps we may have just returned back to square one and we'll need to definitely catch up once the pandemic is over. In terms of maritime insecurity, I fear that there is also a lot of emphasis on hard security concerns, predominantly because of these exacerbated inequalities. A lot of the narrative surrounding our maritime security are shaped within a male-dominated structure environment. And so, basic resource management issues like illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing are being dealt with norms that focus a lot more on national security, how we can preserve our territory, instead of including more women into the discussion, so that we can instead shift the narrative towards talking about how we can work together, how we can get regional coordination in order to better preserve our environment, in order to better tackle illegal fishing, and what kind of grassroots programs can we pursue. So definitely, pandemic has hit us heavily and hard, especially in exacerbating gender inequality, which has shaped our narrative and also the sustainability of our maritime environment.
Yes, absolutely. Really, Jahani, do you have your final response before we close our Q&A section?
Thank you, Whitney. Coming back to Azani's point also, for example, in Bali, of course, the pandemic has a huge impact on the tourism here in Bali, which has come to a screeching halt. And what we see in a way, there are positive and negative things about that. For now, for example, in Bali, in Nusa Penida, marine protected area where we work, because of the lack of tourism pressure, the coral reefs were actually striving, fish were coming back and so forth. But at the same time, due to lack of enforcement and lack of monitoring, you also get more into illegal activities over time. And what is interesting though in Bali and in Nusa Penida is that the community shifted from tourism to seaweed cultivation, which is a great opportunity for them. And women play a major role in seaweed cultivation. My first slide was actually taken in that area. And so there are also opportunities where we can really engage women again in a meaningful way and empower their role. Same for the blue swimming crab fisheries in Lampung and Java, where we support the women pickers in leadership programs and also building their technical skills to remain very engaged economically as well in these fisheries. And I think over time, post-COVID, I think we all look forward to a sort of blue recovery, but in a sustainable way, with ocean sustainability, equity and inclusion becoming the pivotal components, I think, moving forward. And I think more and more there is a narrative about equity and equality, which was really became clear during the COVID, during the pandemic situation, that disparities are becoming exacerbated by this. So to address this, but also address ocean sustainability, we really have to look into equity and equality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rudy. All right, and before and as we approach the end of this section, I'd like to just give a big thank you to Ms. Johani, Dr. Mujahid, and Dr. Salah for your insightful remarks and the wonderful participation of the audience in our Q&A session. But before we close, we're going to actually run our final polling question. What is or are the best ways to increase women's participation in the maritime sector? Please feel free to select all that apply, and you'll have about 20 seconds to submit your remarks or your answer to the question. Sharing these wonderful results, and while gender mainstreaming as the most popular choice, but very popular all around. Thank you everyone for your wonderful participation and attendance in this webinar. It's been an honor being with you for the last 90 minutes, and I will now turn the floor back over to the Pacific Forum to close the session. Thank you.
Great, thanks Whitney, and thanks to all of our panel. You did an excellent job despite our minor technical difficulties. So I just wanted to make a few announcements before we close this session. First, there is a post-event survey that will open when you exit this webinar. We'd be grateful to our audience if you could take a few minutes to let us know what you thought about this session. Second, we will be publishing the recording of the session in the coming weeks on Pacific Forum's YouTube channel. So if you know someone who couldn't join us live, please direct them there. You can find the link to our YouTube channel in the chat box now. And finally, please stay tuned for Pacific Forum's next Women, Peace and Security webinar celebrating women's suffrage in the United States this August. The registration announcement for that event and other Pacific Forum webinars will be sent to email subscribers and posted on Pacific Forum Facebook and Twitter. Thanks again to our moderator, to our panelists, and to our audience for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Aloha.